Good afternoon. Thank you for having us here. I'm Doolub, the founder and CEO of Elms Consulting, here with a partner of Elms, Butler, to talk about doing business differently. Elms Consulting actually sits in the private sector. But when I talk about doing business differently, I'm not just talking about the way the private sector does business differently. I'm talking about how we all do business differently. And just to kick off, a bit about Elms and the work of Elms. Elms was founded 10 years ago with a key focus on bringing together people and the work of the private sector, the public sector and the non-profit sectors. Connecting those dots, but also bringing in the relevant pieces of work that are ready to move forward, enabling dialogues between people across those sectors. And as I often say, really just lighting the litmus paper and stepping back and letting things happen. Most of our work has focused on islands, islands for sustainable change, sustainable development, and the reason for that is because we believe that islands provide the perfect model for many sustainable solutions, given their size and the availability of natural resources. And the exciting thing that we believe that exists for the private sector is the ability to scale up those models and aggregate those models and replicate them. And much of our work has focused on the Caribbean and on the energy sector, and working with islands to transition from utilising and importing huge amounts of fossil fuels, spending nearly a third of their GDP on fossil fuels, to transitioning to renewable sources of energy. An opportunity that we believe is very exciting for the private sector. A course of action that has prompted very much funding from the typical donor communities, and now what we really want to see is the catalysing, if you like, of private financing. And so we've worked with people like Sir Richard Branson to really get behind islands, working with heads of state, working with various NGOs in that space, multilaterals, development banks. And so that's a key focus for us. That certainly has been a key focus for us over the last 5 to 6 years. I'll hand over shortly to Jerry. Jerry Butler is here, and I guess demonstrates one of the ways that we believe we're working differently. Elms can't create change on its own. We can definitely promote change, we can talk about change, we can work with partners, but we cannot effect change on our own. Everything that we do is with partners. All the work that we engage in is with partners across the world, from the private sector as well, but also from the non-profit and public sector. And so it kind of sits very well with me that Jerry is here with me today, talking about the same issues, bringing in his own experience to it. So Jerry, over to you.
I think your introduction on what Elms do pretty much dovetails into what we've been doing for a lot of our life. From my perspective, I come from the private sector side of business in the Caribbean. So I was born and raised in the Bahamas. I trained as a New York State CPA, and I did my MBA at University of Miami. I studied a bit of law in London, and I studied a bit of economics. And for a long time, I was a banker with a major international bank. And after that, I moved from the private sector and started advising and consulting in the public sector space. And then in 2004, I was elected to the board of directors of the Inter-American Development Bank. And for those of you who are not fully familiar with the Inter-American Development Bank, the architecture of financing development in countries usually starts at the top with the World Bank. which originally was set up as the Bank for Reconstruction and Development after the war in Europe, and branched out to be a bank for reconstruction and development all over the world. And thereafter, for more efficiencies, the banking network for development banking was divided up into regions. So there's an African Development Bank, an Asian Development Bank, a European Development Bank, and then there is the oldest and the largest of the development banks, which is the Inter-American Development Bank, which is responsible for development banking in the Western Hemisphere, from Argentina in the south all the way up into the Caribbean. So when I was first elected to the board, there were 14 of us, boards of directors. And for the last 14 or so years, I've been re-elected on 3 different occasions. And that's when my role shifted from being a profit-oriented banker to being a banker dedicated to socioeconomic development in Latin America and the Caribbean. It was quite an experience dealing with clients who needed resources, but for the most part were incapable sometimes of managing those resources because they lacked the capacity to do it, either the intellectual capacity or the matching financial capacity. And yet at the same time, those clients, which were all countries, were deserving of an opportunity to provide a better growth pattern and a much more robust socioeconomic development plan for their citizens. So I dedicated my work to making sure that in the Latin American and Caribbean region, and in the Caribbean in particular, we got a couple of things done to improve the socioeconomic climate of its citizens. To give you an idea of how diverse the little space of the Caribbean is, the third wealthiest country after the United States and Canada in the Western Hemisphere is in the Caribbean. And the poorest country in all of Latin America and the Caribbean is in the Caribbean. And in both of those diverse scenarios, at any time in life, in my case, where I was born and raised in the Bahamas and I still live in the Bahamas, at any time in my life from June the 1st to November the 30th of any year, because of an extremely incredible, uncontrollable event that you call climate change, the wealthiest country could become the poorest country, or the poorest country could somehow stabilize and become the wealthiest country. And that is because of an event. On this side, you might call it a typhoon. On my side, we call it a hurricane. And in the case of the poorest country in the last 10 years, in 2010, which would have been Haiti, they were hit with an earthquake that basically destroyed 300,000 lives and wiped them out. And on October the 6th, 2016, the wealthiest of the Caribbean countries was hit with a Category 5 hurricane that it had never experienced since 1929. And that effectively wiped out a substantial portion of their economy. So it is really a sobering type of career to be engaged in, where you're not focused on total profitability from the private sector side. You're focused on developing a socioeconomic climate where people are better, and yet at the same time, Mother Nature could effectively wipe out all the work you did with basically 3 days of a hurricane force that affects either of the societies. So with that in mind, I would say the most important reason for us to be involved in Eye and Earth, and the most important reason for us to focus on the need for critical, important, timely data for us to survive climate change is basically because what we're trying to do is preserve a lifestyle and a way of life that basically we don't want to settle on the unpredictability of losing it every year during the period June 1st to November the 30th. And working with Maya and working with the Inter-American Development Bank and working with governments turns out to be not the optimal solution, but working with Maya for Maya to bring the private sector on board and working with governments to create a policy environment where the private sector finds an environment that the use of data will help them stay sustainable and resilient and make money is something that we are totally focused on now as part of our work in the development banking system. So, Maya, maybe you should tell them about one of our very special projects where governments, through heads of states, integrated renewable energy into their system to change the way we look at our energy matrix, which is basically a contributor to climate change.
Sure. So I think we talk about decision making and we talk about leadership and demonstrating leadership. And one of the key projects that we're involved in at the moment, which is really kind of supporting and driving leadership from islands, definitely. At the moment, primarily working in the Caribbean, but certainly Jerry and I were at COP21. And we worked with islands at COP21 and were very much motivated by the passion, by the strength of voice from islands. And we really kind of wanted to make sure that that leadership was heard and seen across the world. Most recently, we've been working with heads of state in the Caribbean to demonstrate the tangibility of renewables, to kind of set a standard and say, this is our intent, this is what we want to do. And so we've been working with heads of state to implement solar on key iconic buildings, on government buildings, where there is a heads of state that has a publicly owned residence on their residence or governor's residences. And this has been fantastic. As I say, it sets out that renewables are tangible right now. It does set out the leadership, we believe, of those islands, setting out the direction that they want to go in. And recently as well, if you go to some parts of the Caribbean, I think Antigua, when you fly into Antigua, the first thing you see is this wonderful array of solar. And what we've been able to do as well in those projects is bring together expertise from around the world, team it up with local talent and skill, and have the implementation team actually demonstrate capacity building on the job, if you like, boosting the profile of the local teams that have implemented the solar arrays, and really making it an island-owned event, an island-owned initiative. That kind of worked as that was something that arose from some of the broader work that we've been doing with other partners in the region on renewables, and really kind of in some ways, I feel like that much of our work has been about cheerleading. As I say, ELMS are not the one that can make the decisions, that can create change. Sometimes I feel like we cheerlead, we bring people together to have the conversation. We try and trigger action by really driving some of those projects, like, for instance, the implementation of solar on government buildings, or energy efficiency in schools and hospitals. We trigger those by kind of emphasizing that they are ready to go now, and therefore they should move now. What I found, and Jerry can probably add to this with his amazing insight into Caribbean politics, but certainly that level of change in the Caribbean, and I think it's different across the world, but that level of change in the Caribbean for an island to really get behind a movement that says, we don't want to spend a third of our GDP anymore on fossil fuels. We want to transition to renewable energy, is something that has to happen, first of all, top down. I think we've seen scenarios where that kind of change can only happen kind of from the bottom up, and maybe the Pacific provides some good examples of that. The island of Samso in Denmark, I think, kind of started from a community-led project, but definitely in the Caribbean, it's been the case where that has to happen top down. So I think what we're counting on is working with the will and commitment of governments. And one of the questions that I used to ask constantly, or we used to talk about constantly, is, what does that will and commitment mean? And from governments, I think it means that they make a commitment to looking at policy, looking at regulation, for instance, around things like energy or telecoms, and being prepared to make the changes that are needed, being prepared to create the incentives for that type of transition. And so, as I say, I think it needs to happen top down. I think in terms of, well, how do we use data to get behind that kind of leadership? Once, a government has set out its intent, how can we use data in a better way? And I think by increasing the capacity, I've heard people talk about capacity needs here today, and I think Jerry and I hear it all the time in workshops and conferences. And so I think certainly the need to develop and build capacity within governments, across communities, and kind of share expertise that is coming from the private sector, open up the development programs that are being worked on so hard by the non-profit sector, and really kind of get people to use that data in ways that can, as I say, kind of trigger projects to happen, catalyze the flow of capital from the private sector. Jerry, I think you will know from the IDB the number of studies that are funded around energy efficiency in hotels across the Caribbean, around transitional pathways for energy, for diversifying the energy mix on islands. I've heard people ask questions. I've been in St. Lucia and I've heard people say, well, how can we start collecting wind, information on wind here in St. Lucia? And, I just happen to know that, there are huge institutions in Europe, in Germany, that actually have done those studies on wind in St. Lucia. And so why are we not sharing that more effectively? If the studies have been commissioned, for instance, by a private utility, how much more benefit could that bring if they were to sit down around the table with governments, share that information, share that expertise, and start shaping decision making in that way? And then also opening it up to the community. I don't know huge amounts about kind of science and the research and the data that's available around our oceans and coastal environments, but I do know that there is a hell of a lot out there. And I also know that there are many communities living on islands that actually don't know about the amazing wealth and resource that they have naturally in the oceans. Jerry threw at me the other day a stone or something, a mineral that was found in Bahamian waters that can do amazing things. So I think, there is that issue that the data is there, data is emerging, there's data that's there. I think we need more direction and capacity building on how that's used. I think we certainly need more information around the best way to develop solutions. I talk about the role of the private sector, and, for us, everything about addressing climate change is how we engage with the private sector to develop market-based solutions to climate change. And so again, I think, why are we not using that data to make sure that the private sectors are shaping those opportunities, obviously to suit their own commercial needs, but actually to live out what we're saying can happen, to create the jobs locally on islands, to create local business opportunities, responding to community knowledge, local knowledge, inside knowledge, using that to help actually shape the solutions. So I've kind of gone on and on and on there, and I maybe some frustration came out there as well, Jerry. But I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, it's very interesting being at an event like this where you've got the World Data Forum going on next door, and you have this wonderful focus from the government of Dubai on this Eye on Earth data sort of portion of the World Data Forum. what used to really frustrate me at the level of the World Bank is oftentimes when there was statistical information produced on the world, when it got to small island developing states like the islands in the Caribbean, uh, the data value was always NA, which meant not applicable or not available. And well, where obviously where there is a weakness, there is an opportunity. And so to be in an environment like this where you talk about data as if data is a normal public good that everybody here knows about and is out there, and to come from an environment where as soon as I'm sitting with a prime minister or a minister of finance and I mention data, he says, well, where did you get it from? is a fantastic experience. And I think that with the 17 sustainable development goals and with the focus we have here on data, we have to understand that in small island developing states, like my countries, the countries I was responsible for, Latin America and the Caribbean, but more so in the Caribbean, when we discuss capacity issues when it comes to data, we are really focused on several elements of that capacity issue. The first element is the collection of data. We just don't have the capacity to create the points of geospatial collection, much less the competency of what we're collecting over a time interval. Is that because we don't have enough universities or enough people with no time on their hand? No, we have plenty of people who sit around listening to reggae music and just hanging out. But if you say, listen, I need you to do some work, what kind of? I want you to collect data on how many fish swam by you today. You guys gonna say, well, that sounds like hard work. And the next guy next to him will say, yeah, and hard work never killed anybody. And he'll say, but I'm not taking any chances. And that is essentially what happens. An environment where one, the collection of data is an issue. Two, access to data. Access to data. If data was a public good in most of our island states, then our developmental index would increase exponentially. But actually, in a pirate colonial environment, he who has the data is king and normally the wealthiest of persons. So to preserve your wealth and to be a king, what is it you do? You spend a lot of time denying access to data. That leads to a second opportunity. And then, of course, some of the most educated people are not the most learned people. So there is a lot of data, but it means nothing if you can't convert it into information. And so the third point is to be able to take the data that you have access to and convert it into information that is interpretable and readily available for either the private sector to turn it into money or for the public sector to turn it into really sensible policy issues that help with our preservation. And then, of course, the last part of this whole equation where we go from collection of data to access to data to turning it into information is this whole business of creating a digital superstructure, the Internet of Things. It's, to sit in a taxi cab and to be able to say to the taxi driver, you accept Apple Pay or PayPal is remarkable. That's what happened here for me. You do that in the Caribbean, guy will say, no, man, me only want cash because that's our environment. But when you, for example, we did a loan to the government of Jamaica, a soft loan, to engage in digitizing their economy as part of this whole subset of creating an environment with access to data. Most of the loan resources, believe it or not, are simply dedicated to creating a single digital identity for each person. What you have is a guy has a driver's license that has one digital identity. He gets a driver's license in one part of the island. He commits a crime. He gets a driver's license right next to the police station in the other part of the island. He's a different person with a different name. So this same guy now goes to claim Social Security. He's got another name and another ID. Or he goes to the hospital for public services, or he enrolls his kid in a school. All different names, all different identities. So the most important opportunity for the Caribbean now is to create a digitized environment where individuals in the Caribbean have a digital signature. Unfortunately, we haven't been using Dubai as our model. We've been looking to Estonia. And if some of you are familiar with the Estonian environment, you realize that the former Prime Minister of Estonia was my guest about 2 years ago. And I don't know how, it sounds very believable. We don't know if it'll work in the Caribbean, but everybody votes digitally. And you can look at your neighbor's tax returns online. Everything is open, transparent, and digitized. So in this environment where we're talking about data, I think the opportunity for me now moving back from the development world back to the private sector is to learn from this environment how I can turn just the simple concept of creating data and taking that data and making that information, how I can turn that concept into an opportunity in the Caribbean and attract people like you from billion-dollar Dubai environments to million-dollar Caribbean environments where you could help us leap forward in a socioeconomic way. We need data to help us develop. And that is why a London-based entity like a Maya and a Elms Consulting can bring the partners together and focus on us and teach you that there is a different world. When you picture the Caribbean, you see us under coconut trees and you see us hanging out, having a good time, etc. But the truth of the matter is, we really want to reach a point of efficiency where our GDP output and our GDP per capita is on a trajectory of improvement, and we attract the type of investment and the type of opportunities to contribute to a growing world that we see in places like Dubai.
Sure. I've noticed although it's not necessarily a packed room, there's always a bit more ripples of laughter when Jerry's talking than when I'm talking. If you haven't worked it out, I'm the good-looking one, he's the charming one. But I think kind of what I wanted to move on as well, and one of the reasons that it's great having Jerry here today is also, I think what would be great to develop in the private sector is, and when I say the private sector, I'm not just talking on behalf of myself or my firm, which sits in the private sector. I'm talking from a ton of discussions that we've had with the private sector, where we brought a few years ago, Jerry, you were there, 4 years ago, I think, or 5 years ago, I was somehow able to convince Sir Richard Branson that it would be a really, really good idea for him to give his home up for about a week and have a bunch of people from the Caribbean, but also globally, from the private sector, from utilities, from community organisations, and from the governments. We had heads of state there. I convinced Sir Richard that it would be a good idea to have them all at his house, discussing, how we actually make projects happen in the Caribbean. Organizations like the IDB and others have been putting huge amounts of dollars, I understand, into into ensuring that we all understand it's a good idea, and it's taken ever so long for projects to be implemented. So that was a kind of typical convening where what we did is we had heads of state go head to head with certainly with captains of industry across sectors, not just energy, but also transport, hotels and tourism, agriculture, water, waste, and also community leads, and really kind of tackle, well, what are the market barriers? And we keep getting told that within the private sector, there are literally billions, trillions of dollars that can be tapped into once the market barriers can be overcome. And I think, so kind of getting back then to the point that I wanted to make around data is, I think what would be great would be to have a better understanding in the private sector as to how does certain types of data or bodies of data or research come about? What motivates the funding organisation to have that research carried out, and actually who does it benefit? Is it benefiting local fishing communities? Is it benefiting young people who are leaving the Caribbean to study in North America or Europe and not having jobs to go back to in the Caribbean? Or actually, is it benefiting some really wealthy guys in the private sector that want to ensure that that their companies can kind of go out, can invest in these opportunities? I think, you know, that it would be good to kind of understand how some of that data is driven, why some of it is used and why some of it isn't used, whether governments kind of push back on some of the data and don't use it because they feel that they're being kind of pushed in one direction or another, but to just have a bit more openness, if you like, as to why that data has suddenly become available, or why so much money is going into collecting that data, and actually how can communities benefit from it. Is that something you can provide any insight into, Jerry?
Well, most of the times in the Caribbean experience, the creation of data is reactive and usually based on a crisis. Because something happens and action is required, you have to get the information to make it work. And you get the information, oftentimes it's limited and not historical information, and you react because you have to show you react. And these are democracies. So they are politicians in 5-year cycles. And in a 5-year cycle in the Caribbean over the last 20 years has been very interesting. Very few governments have lasted more than 5 years. The guy gets voted in, he knows he has to make a quick fix. The appearance of doing something is equally as important as not doing anything at all. And whether he does something and it's right or not right, or whether she does something is right or not right, at least you can go to the polls and say, I did something. I think that type of reactive use of data or reactive search for data is slowly but surely dissipating. And we're seeing the Caribbean become a place of more studious research and a place of more collection of data, not just for us in this generation, but for generations going further. But I think that in order to make that resilient and consistent and sustainable, the Caribbean's most significant deficit is the lack of universities, a multiplicity of universities. It's been very interesting because recently, because of the deficit in medical schools in the United States, a tremendous amount of private medical schools have been looking to open up in the Caribbean. And take, for example, the island of Grenada. About $1.5 billion in GDP output, small compared to what we see here, right? But large in the Caribbean space. Grenada, less than 12 years ago, had 400% of its GDP wiped out by a single hurricane. You flew over Grenada and everyone looked like they had a swimming pool. It was just blue tarp on their roof, covering the roof. The prison was destroyed, all the prisoners got out. The stadium that had been built by a Chinese consortium collapsed. The governor's mansion collapsed. The prime minister was without a house. And 12 years later, and we engaged in a very robust opportunity to restructure their economy and forgive their debt at the IMF level. 12 years later, if you go to Grenada right now, 26% of its GDP output is a single medical school. That medical school has more than 7,000 students, paying an average tuition of 60,000 US dollars a year. And you can't get a flight into Grenada because the students' parents and the students are flying back and forth visiting. So Grenada's economy has gone in fact, it's the only economy of most of my Caribbean economies that I was responsible for where the growth rate has exceeded 4%. And compared to, say, Jamaica at 1.5%, that's incredible, 4% growth rate. Now, the most interesting thing about Grenada on the data side is because of that medical university, there's an awful lot of research in collecting data on medical issues, right? If you sit in the airport and you watch the normal passenger airplanes in Grenada get ready to load their cargo, a country in the Caribbean exporting agricultural products to the United States of America, you know, the greatest and most efficient agricultural economy, something has to be wrong, right? But when you open up the boxes that are going on the airplane, there is a wild fruit that grows wild in every Caribbean country. From the time I was a young boy, when I was sick, my grandmother made me eat this fruit, and all of a sudden I felt better. Well, apparently there's research going on in Florida at major universities in Florida that are indicating that this fruit is such an incredible antioxidant that it helps stop cancer or it helps prevent cancer. So for whatever reason, the Grenadian Medical School has discovered that, and now every farmer in Grenada or everyone in Grenada with a backyard is collecting this fruit, exporting it to the US, all because of data in medical sciences that the medical school had in Grenada. Now, if this medical school or this university was not in Grenada and this research had not come about, it would be unlikely that the private sector opportunity for exporting agricultural products to the United States would have ever been a possibility for Grenada. So yes, Maya, the data that the politicians are usually working with has been reactive and crisis driven. And that is because there isn't a tremendous level of intellectual research that is associated with something that's not a crisis or something that is not a reaction. But I believe that with the introduction of more intellectual pursuits and more universities, that we will see that changing. And Grenada is an example of that. If you all read the press over the last 2 weeks, two scientists from Jamaica, when we were growing up, along the high tension electrical wiring in the grid, we always used to see a little weed that grew on these, and it turned brown and it stayed there, and in the spring it always turned green, and we always wondered how this little, we call it a tumbleweed, how it could survive. Well, some guys at the university have done some research, and the patent just came out last week. Two Jamaican scientists based in the US have now patented this as a tremendous opportunity for inhibiting the growth of cancer cells It's in the newspapers right now. And that too is another example of how, when you're not crisis driven or reactive to collecting data, but you have a set of institutions that normally produce the research on data, you actually can improve the socioeconomic opportunities in a country. And I haven't even gotten to the work on the data research we're doing on energy, or the work on the data research that we're now doing on climate change and the weather and hurricanes, and how, as a result of just that work on climate change, the weather and hurricanes, within the last 8 years, most of you would take it for granted, but no Caribbean government had hurricane insurance on its properties. Come on, didn't I tell you we have hurricanes every year from June the 1st to November 30th, and they could wipe us out? You have to ask why no one was ever able to purchase insurance, or why no one ever did, right? Well, because of the work we've done, we've been able to develop a Caribbean catastrophic risk insurance fund where, using parabolic measurements, Caribbean countries can now insure the assets of a government for, basically a shot in the arm. Not the exact value of the assets, because a lot of public assets are priceless, if not undefinable. I mean, I don't know. A road like the new bridge that was unveiled today from mainland China through Hong Kong to Macau, that took $20 billion to build. But can I, as an economist, put a true value on that bridge, given the future connectivity between Hong Kong, Macau, and China? No, probably not, right? So a lot of governmental assets, you can't really put a true value on to insure them, but to not have any level of insurance and to be hit with a catastrophe annually is insane. Well, as a result of data we've been collecting on climate change using the National Oceanic, I think it's the Oceanic Association, and NOAA, I think they're, and Caribbean universities, we've been now able to studiously look at climate change as an opportunity to create an insurable industry. So yes, data has been crisis driven and reactive, but that is changing. It's changing slowly, and as the will of the private sector and the policy gets set in for the public sector, I think when you fly across the pond to the Caribbean, you'll begin to see a brighter future.
Yes, but and I think that is happening. I think the issue of policy being so reactive, I think, remains frustrating at the moment. But it's strange since hurricanes Irma and Maria, and perhaps Jerry, you've heard the same. But I've heard a number of people across the private sector and the not-for-profit sector almost say, not that it was a godsend, because it obviously wasn't a godsend, it devastated lives, but in terms of triggering a huge effort of work, again, that the IDB, I understand, have been pretty engaged with, around implementing more resilient infrastructure. That has really kind of kickstarted since Irma and Maria, but it still confounds me, given some of the global crises that we have around people that are displaced, whether it's from conflict situations which actually have started as a result of drought, of famine, of climate change, or whether it is because of natural disasters. This issue of being reactive is still frustrating. And again, I think by bringing in the private sector, by utilizing the expertise, by utilizing some of the financing mechanisms that I think are waiting to be triggered, that actually we can shape more proactive solutions. So in terms of kind of how we do that, I think I think we need to think about how we encourage the private sector to engage more in the sharing of data, and certainly private sector organisations are often involved in the collecting of data. But I think, you know, kind of what can we do more around shaping that data? How can we make even the collection of data something that is more interactive? Again, if we look at the Caribbean, you will know better than me that there are a number of marine protected areas where, you know, kind of a lot of research activity goes on. I think what we're seeing now is a bit of a shift or a really fantastic trend in the tourism industry, for instance, where market-based solutions are being developed that integrate, you know, the commercial business of tourism with the collection of data. So I think opening up opportunities that are a lot more like that, where the actual data collection itself is market-based, first of all, kind of brings the private sector into it in a way that gives them a level of ownership that may help kind of shape some of the solutions that they are developing. I think it also opens up fantastic opportunities for local communities. You know, I think there's a lot of work that goes on in places like Europe and North America in, you know, kind of shaping and looking and scoping out what are the opportunities for North American firms in the Caribbean, what are the opportunities for European firms in the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean. And I think, you know, the private sector working with these other sectors actually could do could put a lot of drive into scoping out, well, what are the local business opportunities in the Bahamas, in Trinidad and Tobago, if we can see this, you know, program of energy transition, for instance, unfold on these islands. You know, how can we scope out the local education opportunities? How can we scope out the local business opportunities, job creation? And again, I think that's a discussion that needs to be had across all sectors, and one that I think the private sector can and should play a key role in, whether it is looking at global opportunities or opportunities that are bringing more revenue that stays on island. So it's not just about, you know, investors coming in and putting lots of dollars into something to make it happen, because it's a fantastic investment opportunity. I think, you know, if we can engage people locally in that collection of data, then, you know, they're at the very start of the journey, so they're not being as responsive. They're also part of creating solutions that are proactive. So, and again, you know, these are conversations that we promote, that we trigger. Jerry and I come together mainly because we ourselves are in the business of convening people in rooms like this, in larger conferences, and really kind of setting about making that conversation happen. I think, and I hope, what the difference is that we are lucky enough to have that continued engagement with the people that attend our workshops, our conferences, to actually be able to follow through a lot of the discussions that we had, going back to the summit that we had on NECA. Everyone that took part in that discussion had to come back to you know, the final day with a joint commitment that they had made, and that was between parties from the private sector, the government and the non-profit. You'll remember, Jerry, you know, one of the commitments that were made were about doing energy efficiency audits on schools and hospitals, and true enough, I think it was 6 months after the event, we had that walkthrough around a number of schools in the Bahamas for energy efficiency, and that's being followed up with the program of energy efficiency measures across schools and government buildings. So I think kind of having all the different sectors at the table, you know, kind of at the very beginning, when you are pulling together the data, can produce, number one, kind of more effective outcomes, but number two, can actually help the process along of getting those implemented, because you're not waiting to share the message further down the line. You've had the people around the table in the first instance. So that's kind of my thoughts on how we use data better to engage the private sector. I think I kind of just wanted to talk a bit more about this issue of the natural capital and I keep referring to islands because primarily that's where certainly my work is, and in reality, where most of your work is because of the region that you're in, the Caribbean, and just focus on this issue of using data better on natural resources. And I think, I'll use the oceans as an example. I think the whole world has this issue of sea blindness, where we all know that the oceans exist and they're huge, and we fly over them, we may sail on them, but that there isn't this really deep understanding of how critical they are, what they mean, what they are as a source of food, and the crisis that they're in. And so again, I think, how, with the amount of data that we have on the oceans, how is that message not being shared more effectively? Again, how can the private sector engage more in this through some of the work that they're doing? So that people do understand when they come into hotels and all of a sudden they have paper straws to use instead of the plastic straws. I think now we're seeing that connection being made. But it's taken us a long time. It's taken us a long time to get there. I think so. I think let's engage the private sector in the way that this hotel is in relaying that message. Let's engage them a lot more in that, in some of those issues that are so critical, like the oceans. Let's also look at how we better utilize. When I talk about natural resources on island, and very often I'm talking about the sun, the wind, the oceans. I think there's there's one point that we kind of sometimes miss, and that's actually the natural skills and talents on islands, and how can we better utilize those skills and talents. I think, is it St. Lucia that has the highest number of laureates per square capita or something? Is it St. Lucia? No, it is St. Lucia has the highest number. And so, why are we not kind of better utilizing the natural skills and talents that we have in small developing countries, in small developing islands? And again, I would shift that to the private sector. I think there's certainly a role for the government there, but definitely a role as well for the private sector, the way that they do business on island, and how they engage with skills from those local communities. So,
this whole theme of Eye on Earth, the ability to convene, converge, and collaborate, is an opportunity really for small island states to become a focal point of a discussion. In fact, as a result of attending this meeting, whenever I meet with our heads of state, it is going to be very interesting to make a proposal to let's convene an Eye on Earth forum in the Caribbean. And why is that important? Well, it's important because besides the Eye on Earth theme, there's also the need in small economies like ours to be able to share best practices. And if we can share best practices, then we can focus on an opportunity that most Caribbean governments want to be able to focus on for their citizens, and that is the localization and the indigenization of talent. I think oftentimes, as Maya explained, because of our colonial past, when we have a need for a solution, we look to the United Kingdom or the United States or Europe for persons to come in to give us a solution to a problem that we have to live with. And those persons come in and they leave, the solution works temporarily, and then we're stuck with the same problem all over again. I think that in the third stage of the best practice learning curve, if there is a way for a sustainable engagement where we indigenize the learning experience and the opportunity associated with what data can mean to our economies on a regular basis, being collected, maintained, analyzed, and turned into information, we would certainly improve the way we handle everything that we do and the way we grow. And now, in the case of energy, we in 2008 we created the CREF, the Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum, for which Maya was very much involved with. The next Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum meeting will be in Miami from November the 7th to the 9th. So next month, we have approximately 600 people who are stakeholders from around the world who gather once a year to address the energy crisis in the Caribbean. And what is that energy crisis? Well, pretty much 100% of all Caribbean countries, they generate at least 90% of their energy from fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are going to be some of the dirtiest. Slow speed diesel or heavy fuel oil, high sulfur content, poisoning the atmosphere, etc., right? And what is the Caribbean a victim of regularly? Climate change. So the Caribbean has decided, well, we are contributing to climate change in a negative way, so we need to change our energy matrix. Not to mention the fact that the fossil fuels are all imported and therefore are a heavy burden on the balance of payments of these countries because they don't produce oil. If they have to import it, they have to send out hard-earned currency. So what we did is we came up with a solution where we decided that if we presented this as a problem to the governments and we said, you create a regulated policy environment, then the private sector would find a way to make money out of it. But the private sector needed the data. And for the most part, most of the utilities that are using this fuel are monopolies. And who own the monopolies? The governments. The monopolies were revenue centers. So we're telling the government, well, stop producing energy from dirty oil, right? And the government is saying, but that's how I make my money. So we had to come up with a private sector solution, which was, well, if you create a series of public-private partnerships, or if you give the private sector the opportunity to use the data on consumption and to use the data on the poisoning of the atmosphere, you will find out that maybe what you think is a profit from producing energy from this dirty source is really a poisoning loss. For example, everyone who lives near where a utility generates, what if we could prove that they were all developing as asthma or severe lung illness, and you have to treat them at the hospitals? So now you don't know the true cost of producing energy from this dirty source of fuel. Well, as a result of constantly focusing on those particular data subsets, the private sector came together, and the solution is let's try to create a robust Caribbean grid. And that robust Caribbean grid, when you separate generation from transmission and distribution, would include generation from multiple sources of clean, renewable energy. So we have governments creating policies as a result of signing on to the Paris Accords, where they are indicating that by 2030 and by 2040, the grid for generating will have a focus where it must have a minimum of, in some cases, 20%, 25%, in a case that Maya and I are familiar with, 100% grid penetration on generation from renewable sources. Those renewable sources that work in the Caribbean as a result of research and data are going to be solar. I mean, Germany has the sun maybe 60% of the year, and 26% of Germany's grid is produced from solar. And in the Caribbean, only 1% of the grid is produced from solar. Yet every time you look at a commercial from the Caribbean, everybody's going there for the sun, right? From ocean sources like ocean thermal, or from cavitation devices under the ocean. And then you have wind for wind turbines, right? And then you have these other biodiverse opportunities like forestry, trees, special forms of sugar cane that the Caribbean was great for producing ethanol, etc. So once the government got that information and they decided to set that policy, the private sector jumped right in, started doing the analysis, and what has been discovered is you could really, I mean, in the case of one island where they had an RFP recently, they are producing uh, energy from fossil fuels at about 18 cents per kilowatt hour. And the bids from the private sector to produce energy from wind and from solar came in as low as 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And that really changes the way we use the data on energy to make money. So CREF convenes once a year, and once a year, the private sector just gets an opportunity to bombard the governments on why policy must change and policy must become adaptable to meet the needs of the private sector to produce a new form or a different form of energy for the grid in the form of renewable energy. And everybody who leaves a CREF meeting will leave a CREF meeting feeling empowered that they've met with a policymaker who is going to change the matrix on the way we do business and is going to provide them with an opportunity to do a deal to get into the renewable energy space. By the way, at CREF, the biggest influencer in the private sector has become the utilities. Utilities are finding out that, uh, if you have an electric powered car running on batteries, uh, there's literally no maintenance on it except for changing the brakes versus a car that's running on a combustible fuel engine. So when they sell you a car now, they don't have to employ people to maintain it. Now, of course, some people might see it differently because there are some people who produce cars where the money is made from maintaining the car as opposed from just selling the car. But it changes the way the private sector looks at basically how we do business on the energy side of the Caribbean, and it also changes our ability to say how we are contributing to climate change and how we are contributing to our own future when it comes to being victims of climate change in this particular environment.
Thanks, Jerry. So, in actual fact, I think you kind of brought us to a conclusion um, in your own amazing and very nice way. Not only were you able to do a huge and shameless plug for the upcoming CREF event on the 7th to 9th of November in Miami.
CREF is probably oversubscribed.
But you, I think, also kind of ending on, the examples of, thankfully, we're starting to see now in the Caribbean with ribbon cuttings of various solar projects. I think is a great way to end because it really underlines, if I had to sum up in one sentence what I mean when I say, let's do business differently, the private sector should be operating differently. I think that one most important line for me is let's change the value system so that we're working to outcomes and not outputs. And the solar projects that you mentioned are fantastic examples of that. So.
Thank you. My name is Tanzi Alam. I'm the managing director of Artist Consulting. We're kind of, it's interesting kind of being in this bubble of the UN World Data Forum and I unearth the bubble within that bubble. We're talking about the use of data and decision making, and it's kind of an irrational world we're imagining. Everyone uses data for decision making, and that's good because that's why we're all here. It's important to be fact-based, but there's also another part of the world which, or the places and everywhere it happens where it's not fact-based decision making. So how do we bridge these bonds?
Well, whenever I teach decision making and logic at the university level, I always focus on the consequence of a decision. And making a decision is the easiest thing a politician or anyone can do, or your child can do if you're a good parent. The hardest thing to do is to live with the consequences of that decision. So if a decision is made and it's fact-based, or if a decision is made and it's emotionally based, or like most self-serving people, if a decision is made because it benefits me, that's okay. The thing is, what are you prepared to do to make sure the consequences of that decision go in the direction that, if you're altruistic, benefits mankind, or if you're a capitalist and your personal lives benefit you. So yes, I agree with you that not all decisions are fact-based, but I find as a capitalist who is making decisions that may benefit me, for me and my companies, that if I don't make decisions that are fact-based and based on sufficient quantifiable evidence and data to help me navigate the consequences of that decision, then I usually end up losing money. And so making the decision for me is the easy part. I do that all the time as a boss, living with the consequences and managing the risk of that consequence is the more difficult part. And you can do that better if you have good data and you're rational.
Hello, I'm Elisa from UNESCO, headquarters in Paris. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion, really. I mean, I like your inclusive approach of including all the private sector, the public, but as well the community, and as well with outcomes that can benefit the community and go back to the region. I don't know if you participated in because as you might know, there is the interregional meeting at the end of the month in Samoa on the midterm review of the Samoa pathway, which is the, I mean, as you know, the action plan for SIDS. UN is as well in parallel to this event is organizing a private-public forum, which would be interesting, I guess, in this case, that you intervene. Maybe not this time, but at one point in September 2019, because they will present the outcome of this interregional meeting at the UN General Assembly, and it's good to be heard in this big event, for, specific for SIDS, to advance your agenda. And I will talk to you later for cooperation in the region, in the mandate of UNESCO.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, I really, from the commendable attention that we got from each of you, we are very grateful for the audience, and I am much obliged for your attention. Thank you.